And politics have been fueling, see what we did there? Political chatter here in Ottawa and across the country. First, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith said her province will be the initial proponent for a new pipeline from Alberta to the BC coast. Then, in a broadcast exclusive interview that you just saw with Enbridge's CEO yesterday, right here on Power Play, Greg Ebel made it clear current conditions don't exist for a company like his to back a new pipeline project. Among other things, he wants to see Ottawa's tanker ban to be lifted, but provinces like BC are strongly opposed. All of this as the Liberal government is set to announce the next phase of major projects that it will back next month. So what's at stake for the federal government? Let's bring back the front bench. Sabrina Grover, Melanie Paradis, Carl Belanger, and Abigail Beeman. Sabrina, what is at stake for the federal government here? Because it feels like this is a bit of a showdown where Mark Carney tried to lay the groundwork and say, okay, if there's a proponent, let them come forward. And then Danielle Smith said, well, I see your challenge and I raise you myself as the proponent.
Right. And raising herself as a proponent is not a real project. If Danielle Smith was serious about this, then the people you would see at the table wouldn't be three private sector companies who we kind of already know what their, their table stakes are. It would also include the province of BC and First Nations, who are the real challengers in getting a pipeline project built. That, I would say, would be, signals that Danielle Smith actually wants to build a pipeline project, a successful pipeline project, and not just poke Mark Carney in the eye. But let me take this a step further, right? So, yes, we saw the Enbridge CEO yesterday kind of dance around the fact that maybe if the conditions were right, maybe they'd be a proponent, maybe they'd come to the table. But as late as last month, you saw the CEO of TransCanada say that there is ample space in the current pipeline industry to guide us to 2030. That's 5 years before we think that there's even need for a potential pipeline to come on board. And no one, including TransCanada, Enbridge, has come to the table with money. And that's because the pipeline project isn't viable at this time. And it's not just going to be viable because Danielle Smith put $14 million behind it and said, we should come up with a report on this.
Yeah, and Carl, what I find is interesting as well is where David Eby is on this, because I mean it's clear what he wants or doesn't want, but also the fact that he will be facing a leadership review shortly, and it almost feels like he is trying to sort of really dig in here.
Of course, and it's an easy issue to dig in because there's a lot of popular support behind his position in BC.
Yeah.
So inside his party, but across the province, they don't want that pipeline, and there's no business case for it at this point. And this is what happens when pipeline become an ideology, and that's what it became for Danielle Smith. It's an ideology, so much so that she painted herself in a corner. What if it doesn't happen? Well, she raises the specter of separatism again. National unity was linked to this project. How so? It makes no sense, but she is raising the stakes in that way, painting herself in a corner, and we're going to be put in a position where it's going to be very dangerous for this country in the near future if this doesn't happen.
Yeah, Melanie, do you feel like Danielle Smith, as Carl just said, has really put herself on the ledge here? Because her saying that this is a test of Canada as a country really does sort of lean into that separatist sentiment that we know that she's dealing with out there, out west. But what position does that put Smith in if, after all of this, after $14 million of Albertans' money, that she realizes that, there is nobody that will actually go forward with this? Or is she just trying to put the federal government on notice and say, well, look, you have to deal with the tanker ban and everything else that these energy companies want to get rid of?
Yeah, and they do. Like, she's right to do that. She is right to raise this issue and to try to demonstrate how difficult it's going to be to advance a project. There's a reason why none of the oil and gas companies are saying, yeah, we want to build a pipeline right now. It's not that they don't want to. It's not that there isn't a tremendous amount of demand for Canadian oil and gas products. The world wants our oil and gas. The problem is we can't get it to them because the conditions on the ground are such that our regulatory environment is prohibitive. Mark Carney, during his campaign, said, build, baby, build. That's what he wants to do. But in order to actually achieve that vision, it's going to require a considerable amount of regulatory changes. That's also going to include lifting the tanker ban. And it's going to require provinces that have historically not wanted to have oil and gas projects on their land. They're going to have to think about it differently. We've seen a tone shift from Quebec. BC should probably do some soul searching about this too. We need to be able to get our products to market. We cannot keep relying on north-south pipelines.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Abigail, because Smith also put a bit of a deadline on this. She said, look, I want to see this in the next tranche, which is supposed to be announced before the Grey Cup, even though her study is only basically going to finish in May of 2026. What do you think is going to be the sort of showdown here between the feds and Danielle Smith's government?
So I'll tell you what I keep reflecting on as this story has unfolded, and it was being in Edmonton when that first list of major projects was released, being in Edmonton when Premier Smith sat down with Prime Minister Mark Carney, and the glowing reports that she gave, comparatively speaking, in both those cases. So after her meeting with the Prime Minister, everything was great, and then after that list of major projects where there was no oil pipeline on there and no Alberta project in that first 5, Pathways was in the 10, and she had no problems with it. And I'm still thinking to this day, to be a fly on the wall in that meeting, what was promised or what was said or what was on the table before that Grey Cup, which is also the deadline that the Prime Minister said. They wouldn't even let us, get a picture of the two going in or coming out or meeting. It was, as far hands off in terms of pictures, kept under wraps, and that's the meeting that I'm still thinking about today and wondering what was on the table.
Yeah, and Carl, you wonder, what was that conversation like? What did Mark Carney say to Danielle Smith that made her feel good and that made her go to this position? Is there something that maybe she knows that we don't know yet?
Well, she's trying to push the issue. Maybe she saw an opening in Mark Carney's position, and now it's up to him not to fumble that ball before the Grey Cup. You see what I did there?
Yeah, I see what you did there.
But the issue, though, is that do we actually need this, and in what timeline? Because we're talking about Trans Mountain. It's used, what, 75 to 80% capacity right now. There's still some room there. And with the world going down the electrification route, like how much oil and gas will we need in the future to invest that much money, make sure we're going to get our money back as taxpayers? That's the issue, because right now, the money we spent on the other pipeline projects, I'm not sure Canadian taxpayers got a bang for their buck. Oil and gas companies sure did, but taxpayers, I'm not so sure.
Yeah, Melanie, is it just easy for Pierre Poilievre to sort of sit back and let this play out and let everybody else fight and not really get into it?
Sorry, I just can't get over the notion that we're not going to need more oil and gas, and then in a couple of years, everyone's just going to be electrified and we're not going to need it anymore. I mean, Carl, your tie is probably made of oil and gas. Like, it's in everything. The world needs Canadian oil. It's in every synthetic fiber. It's in plastics. Like, it's not something that we can just say, oh, we're going to be able to turn this off in 5 years. And when pipelines are nearing their maximum, or when they're at like 80%, you shouldn't wait until they're at 100% to start building more pipelines. They take a long time. As we've demonstrated in this country, it takes 15 years to open a mine, never mind build a pipeline. We need to change that. We got to get our regulations in check here. Mark Carney has a lot of work to do on a regulatory environment if he wants to build, baby, build.
Sabrina, you got the last 15 seconds.
Well, this is my most Albertan thing that I'll say, but it's, yeah, you can say oil and gas, but there is room for a gas pipeline. There may just not be room for an oil pipeline, and those are two different things. And I think that that's the realization that, Danielle Smith will come to, and might be the realization that a lot of these companies come to. And I agree that we can be an energy superpower, but remember that just last year, Danielle Smith drove away $33 billion in clean energy investments in this province. So there's lots of different ways to make this case to be an energy superpower, and oil pipeline is not the be-all, end-all of it.